at speed, John Glenn.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground.
New possibilities are opening up for scientific cooperation between countries.
1-0. Liftoff. Americans return to space as Discovery clears the tower.
Discovery, go and throttle up.
Discovery, Roger. Go for deploy.
Base 2 and to everybody in the shuttle program, the crew is go for launch.
Roger. Nice to be in orbit.
We have followed in their footsteps to get us where we are today.
Good afternoon from Starliner Mission Control in Houston. Boeing's Starliner spacecraft comes home today, and we're glad you've joined us to see it take place. I am Stephen Seislaw from Boeing Communications, and with me here is NASA's Gary Jordan. Over across the hall is NASA's Leah Cheshire in the ISS Flight Control Room.
Hey, it's good to be with you, Steve. Everything's looking good for undocking later today. We're looking at an undock 2:36 p.m. Eastern Time, 1:36 p.m. Central. And we did get a go from both the International Space Station and Starliner teams. Starliner's go for undock. Weather's looking good, Steve.
Looking real good. We will also go out shortly to White Sands Space Harbor in New Mexico. That is where the landing teams from Boeing and NASA are getting ready to welcome the spacecraft back to Earth. The journey back to Earth today will start around 1:36 p.m. Houston time, when the hooks unlatch and springs on Starliner's docking ring push the spacecraft away from the International Space Station. The small thrusters on Starliner will increase that separation speed, gradually helping Starliner move carefully away from the orbital laboratory. Today's move away from the ISS is as carefully planned as the rendezvous and docking that took place on Friday. And once Starliner moves away from that forward port, it will fire its small thrusters and perform what's called an outbound fly-around maneuver. That's going to carry it up and over the International Space Station, and then it's going to lower it behind the space station, ultimately leaving the approach ellipsoid. All of those maneuvers will take just about an hour to complete, and then Starliner will be on its course for a landing later today. That landing is set for about 5:49 p.m. Central Time, 6:49 p.m. in the East, and that's where our teams in New Mexico will be waiting for it.
That's right. So we'll continue our coverage this afternoon until the Starliner exits that approach ellipsoid. It is a very important marker. While the spacecraft itself is inside the approach ellipsoid, it is a joint operation. So we mentioned the go from both the space station and Starliner teams that we're tracking go for undock. These teams working together. Steve, once we're outside the approach ellipsoid, it's really up to the teams over in the white flight control room, in the control room from this view that you see to your left. Of course, now working in tandem with the International Space Station flight control teams over there on the right. But it'll really be up to the Starliner team, Steve, to get the Starliner home, like you said, later this afternoon.
It's going to be a busy afternoon, a lot of anticipation for this that has taken place. Now, this mission began more than 5 days ago, almost 6 days ago at this point. And it began with a launch aboard a United Launch Alliance Atlas V rocket from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, Space Launch Complex 41. And you can see there Starliner riding the power of that Atlas V. That was on Thursday evening, and it put Starliner on a course for a precise rendezvous the next day with the International Space Station. Of course, got some great views from the rocket as Starliner was heading up.
Now, it did take about 24 hours to get over to the International Space Station, but finally, after some demonstrations and very carefully coordinated maneuvers to get the Starliner to rendezvous with the orbiting laboratory, it did push its way in for a docking. That docking time was 7:28 p.m. Central Time on Friday the 20th. The Starliner, along that journey, did demonstrate a lot of the capabilities of the spacecraft itself, getting ready for crew to be in inside the vehicle eventually. Tested a commanded attitude hold, tested its abort thrusters, a commanded hold from the International Space Station, its ability to align with the vertical local horizon attitude of the Earth, and then it also retreated outside of the keep out sphere. When it finally approached and made contact with the International Space Station's docking adapter at the forward end that you see there, that was at 7:28 p.m. And that set us up for, it was really the end of the crew day when we saw that, so that was late at night for the International Space Station crew who were monitoring every step of the way. They did eventually open up the hatches the next day. No crew inside, right, so no rush to get that open, but we were able to get some fantastic views inside the vehicle when we opened up that hatch.
And also, we got some great views of the spacecraft itself as it closed in. These are a little bit different than what you may have seen before. These are from alternate cameras on the outside of the International Space Station, looking towards that forward port where Starliner was closing in. Of course, this video is quite a bit sped up quite a bit from what happened live, but Starliner closing in that way to that forward port. You can see the docking ring extended really clearly there, and it was really a great example of what the spacecraft looks like when it's in flight in its docking mode there. And you can see that contact. Starliner came in very clean, and we also got some imagery from inside the spacecraft. This is looking out the window on Starliner during the ascent, during powered flight up through the clouds over Florida on Thursday, May 19th, and heading into that perfect path to reach the International Space Station.
You see that roll maneuver. That was pretty cool outside of the window. The Atlas performed that roll maneuver on the way. Now you're seeing inside, of course, the cargo strapped down, and you can see the vibrations of launch. Fantastic views. That's Rosie the Rocketeer inside, the anthropometric test device that's inside, and of course we got Jebediah Kerman, you see there in the other seat, the two passengers of this uncrewed test flight experiencing the ride aboard the Atlas V. Fantastic views.
And of course, all the fans of Kerbal Space Program very excited to see the mascot Zero G fly up there. Got a great look at him. He had a great flight, I think, and we know from what the crew of the space station told us that he wanted to see a lot of the space station itself as well. He had a chance to get out of the seat a little bit.
Now, these recorded views are from shortly after hatch opening on Saturday, May 21st. That was Cho Lindgren and Bob Hines. They were the ones to actually open up the hatch and get those peeks inside and get to meet Jebediah and Rosie the Rocketeer for the first time in space. It was Bob Hines who was the first astronaut to enter the Starliner spacecraft in orbit.
And that leads us to where Starliner is right at this moment, which is latched to the forward port of the International Space Station. That is the node. That is the connecting port to the Harmony node on the forward-facing side of the International Space Station. And you can see Starliner docked there. That is what the feature there that you see highlighted with the black tiles. That's the side hatch. That's where the crew will enter the vehicle on launch day when it's standing at the launch pad, and later today it is where the landing team, that's the hatch that the landing team will open when after Starliner descends to White Sands Space Harbor, and that's where the landing team will enter the vehicle shortly after that touchdown.
Now, the Starliner, of course, not the only visiting vehicle aboard the International Space Station. You see that was a live view that you were seeing in this animation. You can see where the Starliner is. It's at the very forward end of the International Space Station, so upon undocking, it will pull straight out, and as part of the undocking maneuvers, will fly really over the International Space Station. But you see, it is a very highly visited complex with the Crew 4 Dragon that brought 4 astronauts to the International Space Station, the cargo vehicles, including Northrop Grumman's Cygnus vehicle, as well as 2 Russian Progress cargo vehicles, and then, of course, the Soyuz MS-21 that brought the 3 cosmonauts who are currently staying aboard the International Space Station. 7 crew members on the inside of the station now for Expedition 67. But of course, what we're tracking down is the departure and return of the Starliner spacecraft. What you're seeing here are the incremental steps that we will be guiding you through until they exit that secondary ring on the outside of this graphic, the approach ellipsoid. It'll pull, like I said, straight out and outside of the keep out sphere before performing an outbound fly around. For those who followed us for our approach and docking coverage, there was an inbound fly around as part of that maneuver. The outbound will send it right over the International Space Station. There is another departure burn right when it gets pretty much at the R bar or right above the International Space Station. That'll send it behind and get outside the approach ellipsoid, setting up for some of the burns later. It's pretty short. It's a pretty short journey from the time it undocks from the International Space Station down to touchdown in the western United States in the desert. Just a little bit more than 4 hours is that time.
And we have a little bit of a closer look at the way that's going to look. The fly around, a little more detail of that. We'll go ahead and show that.
Starliner begins the undocking process 1 hour before actually leaving the International Space Station. If all goes according to plan, the spacecraft will be back on solid ground in under 4 hours. Once the NASA docking system, or NDS, is powered up and favorable weather at the landing zone is confirmed, the main hubs holding Starliner in place release. Short booster firings continue nudging the spacecraft further away until it exits the 200-meter keep-out sphere, roughly 21 minutes later. But Starliner will not leave the space station's vicinity that quickly. 26 minutes after departure, the spacecraft will first fly above the station, collecting high-quality imagery of both the laboratory and Earth in its background. Then, 51 minutes after undocking, Starliner conducts the departure initiation burn and leaves the approach ellipsoid. At this point, Starliner's speeding toward Earth and setting up for a successful landing.
And having seen all the maneuvers that Starliner is performing after undocking and on to landing, obviously has the attention of Starliner Mission Control here, and it has just as much attention across the hall, and that is where NASA's Leah Cheshire is surveying the work of the ISS flight controllers.
Thanks, Steve. That's right. I'm here in the Mission Control Center at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. And again, just right across the hall from where Starliner is being monitored. And on the console right now is the Orbit 2 team. This is the second team of the day, monitoring all of the systems aboard the International Space Station. Flight director right now is Vincent LaCourte. He was also the flight director when Starliner arrived on Friday, as well as we have Capcom Rob Hayhurst, who was the Capcom as well on Friday whenever we were monitoring the arrival of Starliner. Now, again, contrary to the name, Hayhurst is not communicating with the capsule itself, of course. He is communicating with the astronauts aboard the International Space Station, of which there are currently 7. Our 3 cosmonauts are Sergei Korsakov, Oleg Artemyev, and Denis Matveev. And then we have 3 NASA astronauts, Kjell Lindgren, Bob Hines, and Jessica Watkins, as well as European Space Agency astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti. Shortly after 12:30 p.m. Central Time, the teams here in Mission Control pulled go for undocking today. And about an hour before undock, Starliner was transferred to internal power, meaning it's not using the power generated on the space station as it has over the last 5 days while it has been docked. Bob Hines and Kjell Lindgren have been working over those days, removing and replacing cargo on the vehicle, as well as training and preparing to monitor the undock process. They were also our 2 prime observers upon arrival of the vehicle. The hatch on Starliner was closed yesterday, which is really when preparation kicked off for when the undocking preparations began. Station has now parked its solar arrays to ensure they won't be affected by any of the burns that Starliner will execute upon its departure from the space station. And the thrusters on the station are inhibited, meaning that there won't be any loads imparted as Starliner undocks from the NASA docking system. After undock, those solar arrays will be returned to their usual auto-track status, and the space station's also in the proper undocking attitude, lining Starliner up with its intended deorbit path. Joint operations here in Mission Control Houston will continue until approach ellipsoid exit, but of course our teams will still track the mission and be watching as Starliner lands in just a few hours. And this paves the way eventually for the future crewed flight test, which will bring Starliner into our rotation of visiting vehicles, bringing astronauts to and from the space station. Now let's take a look inside at the vehicle that has spent the last few days on the International Space Station. This will be the future ride for NASA astronauts with the destination of the space station. Your camera operator here being Kjell Lindgren. As we mentioned, he monitored the arrival and departure alongside NASA's Bob Hines, who is inside the vehicle.
Entering into Starliner. So welcome to Starliner for the very first time ever in space. Here you can see Starliner, and Rosie the Rocketeer is sitting over in the commander's seat, along with her zero-G indicator, Jebediah Kerbal. She's got a great view out her window over there. And then on the crewed vehicles, we'll actually have two other seats in here, and then lots of room for cargo as well. So we hope you enjoyed touring Starliner with us today, and with that, we'd like to hand it back to Houston. Thanks a lot for being here.
That was again a look inside Starliner. Of course, it will seat 4 people in future flights, but the journey was made this time by the anthropometric device Rosie the Rocketeer, honoring the original Rosie the Riveters from World War II. And again, it's a totally autonomous vehicle, but of course the crew will have the ability to fly the spacecraft if needed. We saw this demonstrated last week as it began its approach to the space station. NASA astronaut Kjell Lindgren was able to turn the docking lights off and on the spacecraft, and also commanded a hold at 250 meters. We're about 17 minutes away from that intended undocked target and still receiving reports that the weather is go. Some other components to Starliner are the LiDAR, which is the sensor creating a 3D picture of the space station for Starliner computers. It helps the spacecraft guide itself around the space station when flying nearby. This was developed and tested in orbit aboard the space shuttle as they docked with the space station. This will be turned on. as well as the Remote Analog Interface Unit, which gathers data on the status and health of critical spacecraft systems during all phases of the mission, allowing the important system information to be stored on the spacecraft so engineers can review it once the spacecraft lands. Now, as a flight test, this mission is meant to gather all the data it possibly can about the way the vehicle and all of its systems have performed. This will be loaded into databases to compare it with pre-flight predictions and ultimately produce detailed computer models that will be used to improve and refine future missions. Teams will also uplink the entry landing target. That's the data being sent to Starliner and used by the avionics to calculate the course the spacecraft needs as it'll fly around the space station and then get on the correct path to deorbit and land at White Sands in just a few hours. And teams here in Mission Control Houston continuing to monitor the vehicle, both the International Space Station and Starliner, as we are in those joint operations all the way through approach ellipsoid exit. But until then, we're going to toss it back over across the hall to Starliner Mission Control, where Gary and Steve are going to continue walking you through the mission.
All right, thank you, Leah. Good reports from the International Space Station side. Of course, we're tracking the Starliner and its progress here. Everything continues to look good. We just heard that weather report, and the weather continues to look good. We have folks out at the landing site, and it is, quote, beautiful. So all things looking good for undocking. Right now aboard the International Space Station, it's flying over the southwestern border of Kazakhstan, over the northern Caspian Sea. So some of the views we're getting from in orbit of the orbital sunset are starting to lessen the illumination of the spacecraft itself. The undocking we are tracking is going to be during that orbital nighttime, so it will be dark views when we see the Starliner undock. But again, the team's moving along for that on-time undocking. We are tracking 1:36 p.m. Central Time this afternoon.
And that undocking is going to come in about 14 minutes from now. Launch the flight controllers here. Continuing to watch all their systems. Everything's looking good for that. Of course, this is a flight test, the orbital flight test too for Starliner. And, the whole reason, it sounds cliche, but the whole reason you do flight tests is to find out things about your spacecraft. This is the first time that Starliner has flown that complex choreography for rendezvous and docking. And, whatever you find on this flight test, we're going to go through today. We're going to have the dynamics of undocking, the fly around, and then the return to Earth, landing there. And, we'll go over this, they'll go over this spacecraft, go over all that data very, very thoroughly, make whatever updates need to be made. And, this spacecraft will be returned to Florida, processed, and then reused again on a future mission. There's another crewed flight test coming up. That's going to be with astronauts on board, also going to the International Space Station. That'll be a flight test as well, but with crew on board. Today's mission, this orbital flight test 2, does not include astronauts other than the astronauts that are on the ISS, but no astronauts that are inside Starliner. So a lot of eyes watching this. Like I said, a lot of anticipation. Today the spacecraft has been performing very well throughout this mission, and continues to be careful work ahead. But we're some 5 days and 19 and a half hours into the mission, and looking very good so far.
As the sun sets on the International Space Station in orbit, Steve, like you mentioned, this is a flight test, and there are test objectives for the undocking and landing, which will be carefully monitored by all the flight controllers here in Mission Control Houston, in the Starliner Mission Control Room, as well as International Space Station Mission Control. But it did spend 5 days docked to the orbiting complex. We mentioned a number of objectives that were evaluated and achieved on its approach and docking to the International Space Space Station, but once docked, the mission, of course, did not stop. We were able to go through some of the hatch opening procedures. We were able to test the vehicle itself, understand a little bit better about the habitable environment inside the Starliner spacecraft. We were able to circulate air. We tested some communications with various locations on board the International Space Station. We provided an umbilical between the station and the Starliner to charge the batteries, and tested what's called a quiescent mode. Of course, the Starliner now is in a flight test, and it's only spending 5 days aboard the International Space Station, but its ultimate goal is to do long-duration missions aboard the station, so it'll be spending a long time docked. So it tested a certain mode, almost a standby mode, for when it would be docked during those long periods of time. We had a number of checkouts of the systems itself, and then, of course, one of the biggest things that we were looking forward to on the NASA side in particular was there's 500 pounds of NASA cargo transferred inside the International Space Station, and then 600 pounds of cargo transferred into Starliner and packed for its return to Earth, including nitrogen-oxygen recharge system tanks that'll be refurbished and filled with nitrogen and oxygen that provide breathable air to the environment inside the space station, and they'll be flown later. But we got 3 of those coming home on Starliner. Everything continues to look good. We're still tracking an on-time docking 10 minutes from now.
Look at that view, looking from the International Space Station into the window of Starliner, and we see there Rosie the Rocketeer in her commander seat. Seeing her through the window there, you can see the signature scarf, and of course the outlines of the helmet of the Starliner spacesuit. You can also see, of course, that the interior of Starliner is illuminated. It's definitely shows against the backdrop of this orbital nighttime, but lovely views. I tell you, the cameras are just not disappointing us at all in any way during this mission.
Teams here in Mission Control Houston, the International Space Station flight control teams and Starliner teams still tracking and on time on docking. And that's about 10 minutes from now. This window is one of envy, I believe. It is the window in front of the commander seat of the Starliner spacecraft. That commander has a wonderful view right out the window, the forward window, so they can see a lot of the action going out in front. Rosie gets that lucky seat for this Orbital Flight Test 2 mission.
Quick update on time. Everything's still moving towards that undocking by Starliner at 1:36 p.m. Central Time, 2:36 p.m. Eastern. The command to undock will be sent up to Starliner in a little bit more than 6 minutes from now. That's the authority to proceed, or ATP, and it's basically a command keystroke that the rendezvous officer will send up to the spacecraft, and that's telling its systems that that they are good to enter the this plan for the undocking flight around the International Space Station. Again, to reiterate that Starliner will be flying itself today. There'll be some inputs along the way from flight controllers here in Houston at the Starliner Mission Control, but it will be flying itself autonomously, and once that authority to proceed command is sent, it'll be a little bit less than 2 minutes before the hooks begin unlatching. There's 12 hooks on the nose of Starliner, and 6 of them will open, and then the next 6 will open, and then they'll command the docking system ring to extend, and those springs will be all the force it takes to move Starliner away from the International Space Station's forward port. That'll be followed by a couple of very short thruster bursts, 2 seconds and 8 seconds, with the small reaction control system thrusters, and that'll continue to push away Starliner, gaining a little bit of speed. Again, as if you were watching some of the rendezvous and docking coverage, you know that when 2 spacecraft are flying near each other, everything's very carefully controlled, and all the maneuvers are not only planned out in advance, but they tend to go pretty slow. Even though to us here on Earth, both spacecraft are moving at an orbital velocity of 17,500 miles an hour, relative to each other, a lot slower than that.
Now you see on the right of this row of flight controllers taking the flight director position today in the Starliner mission control room. Our flight control room is Flight Director Mike Lammers. To his left, in the gray suit, is Flight Director Rick Henfling, following along every step of the way.
Okay, copy. We're go for undock, and we'll stand by for your go for steps 3 and 4.
Good read.
That word up to the crew, clearing them, that letting them know that Starliner is go for undocking at its planned time, about a little bit under 5 minutes from now at 1:36 p.m. Houston time.
International Space Station Capcom Rob Hayhurst in the International Space Station Flight Control Room. He's the voice you're hearing relay some of these milestones up to the crew. Bob Hines aboard the International Space Station was the one to answer. Of course, in the Starliner Mission Control Room, of which you're getting a live view now, sitting at the Capcom position, is Canadian Space Agency astronaut Josh Kutrick, as well as the Starliner astronaut aficionado or expert, Sunny Williams. She, of course, the expert on all things.
On to perform steps 3 and 4 of 1.602.
We'll go for steps 3 and 4 in 1.602. Houston Station, ISS attitude control configured for undock. Go to issue undock ATP.
Houston copies.
All right, so with that confirmation from the crew aboard the International Space Station, the teams that you're seeing in this room have the steps to go through and command or allow the Starliner systems to proceed with an authority to proceed, letting the vehicle itself go into an automatic sequence to unlatch the hooks and separate from the International Space Station. That command to be issued about a minute from now.
Rendezvous officer confirming that he has indeed sent up the authority to proceed command to Starliner to undock. Starliner remains on a timeline for undocking in 1 minute 15 seconds from now.
Station Houston on 2, Undock ATP has been sent. Be advised that when NDS hook motors are driving, space-to-space comm may be ready.
Station, copy call.
The hooks on Starliner's nose are set to open. They are going through that motion. Telemetry coming down from the vehicle showing the status of each of the 12 hooks on Starliner. It'll take about 1.5 minutes for the hooks to completely open. Separation confirmed, Starliner. Undocking complete. This undocking coming just as the ISS and Starliner.
Houston on 2, Starliner has established the expected opening rate. Trajectory is nominal. Expect OF1 in 22 minutes at a range of 170 meters.
Station copies OF1 at 170 meters, and looks like good separation.
Houston concurs.
Good words from the crew aboard the International Space Station. They're seeing a good separation as well. That separation time, right on time, 1:36 p.m. Central Time. The International Space Station and Starliner were 257 statute miles over the northern border of Singapore.
Starliner, already 6.5 meters away from the International Space Station, is moving at about 1/10 of a meter per second. Starliner flying free.
Station showing 90 seconds since undock complete. ISS thrusters are enabled.
Houston copies.
View you're seeing here is from the ISS as they track the Starliner moving away. Starliner already 12 meters away from the International Space Station, heading out to a position of about 170 meters, 170 meters, when the outbound.
The overlay cross is looking good.
Houston copies.
And with that outbound fly-around maneuver, which will begin in 18 minutes and 45 seconds, that will push Starliner up and over the International Space Station, putting it on a course for a landing later today at White Sands Space Harbor in New Mexico. That landing set for 5:49 p.m. Central Time. Starliner thrusters continuing to help the spacecraft pick up the pace as it moves away from that forward port of the International Space Station. Starliner now 20 meters. Starliner pace continuing to be about a little bit more than 1/10 of a meter per second. Again, just as Starliner came in slowly during docking, it will move away slowly at these early phases while it is in the proximity of the International Space Station. The lights you're seeing there on the screen, that's looking from the perspective of the space station crew, and those lights are the docking lights. They're in an orbital nighttime at this point, so that's why they highlight a bit more. And at this pace, it'll be about 16 minutes before Starliner and the space station are in orbital daytime conditions, and we'll see a little bit more of the spacecraft. But for now, Starliner at a good pace, moving away as it's supposed to. Flight controllers reporting Vesta and its sensors looking good, doing what they're supposed to. They're not performing any demos on the way out. On the way in, they did, and Vesta is showing just what it's supposed to.
Vesta being the system on board the Starliner spacecraft. Optical guidance, navigation, and control equipment looking at the space station, providing views to here in Mission Control Houston. This view, of course, being from the station side, looking at Starliner, but of course, that's those systems looking good. We're even getting some visuals from the station cameras showing some of the thruster firings that are enabling Starliner to have a slow and steady back away from the station itself.
And Vesta does represent a suite of different sensors, just as you mentioned there, Gary. It stands for Vision-Based Electro-Optical Sensor and Tracking Assembly. That's quite a mouthful, so that's why we call it Vesta, and that's really why there are so many acronyms in the spaceflight business. And so the next acronym occasion that we're coming up on is KOS Exit. And that is the keep out sphere, that imaginary boundary around the International Space Station. Continuing to see some great clear images of Starliner with those thrusters. Those are the very small thrusters, reaction control system thrusters. They produce less than 100 pounds of thrust per firing, and they're just there to fine-tune the Starliner path as it backs away from the International Space Station. But they produce some very lovely imagery, especially against the darkness of space. Starliner now crossing 50 meters, 50 meters away from the International Space Station. Forward port, some of the imagery that we saw just a second ago was actually from the viewpoint of those Vestas sensors on the nose of Starliner looking at the space station. And now the image reversed. This is the space station's view of Starliner as it backs away, continuing at a pace of about 1/10 of a meter per second. Starliner now more than 53 meters away from the International Space Station after a on-time undocking that came about 9 minutes ago at 1:36 p.m. Central Time. Starliner going to continue this this pace going from the Starliner perspective backwards in a relatively straight line. That's going to take place for another just about 12 minutes before the outbound fly-around maneuver is performed, and the thrusters then fire to steer Starliner up and over the International Space Station. All throughout that maneuver, Starliner will keep its sensors, keep its nose pointed at the International Space Station, as those systems inform the Starliner avionics of its place in space, basically showing Starliner where it is, and the Starliner computers deciding where they want to go and how to get there. So a very intricate system, very detailed, and one that Starliner will use throughout the rest of undocking today, and then to follow the course to a landing at White Sands later.
You can see from this monitoring tool some of the reaction control system thruster firings to keep the Boeing Starliner on a steady course straight out from its where it was docked for the past 5 days to the International Space Station. You can see at the top left of this monitoring tool, it's about 63 meters away. We're heading to about 175, just on the outer edge of the keep out sphere, and we'll perform that outbound fly-around maneuver to swing above the International Space Station, hugging that keep-out sphere, just about 175 to 200 meter marker around the space station until we get essentially right above it on what's called the R bar. If you draw a vertical line straight through the International Space Station, it'll go right to that point. You can see on this graphic to about the number 4. There's another burn called the departure initiation burn that allows it to swing.
Houston on 2 for CST, just letting you know everything is still looking really good.
Copy that. Looks good on our end as well.
And that's great words from the International Space Station Flight Control Room. That's Capcom Ray Hayhurst relaying up to the crew who is currently monitoring Starliner's departure from the International Space Station. This whole time, the key duo here for Starliner operations has been NASA astronauts Kjell Lindgren and Bob Hines. Hines, for the undock procedures, takes on the lead role of departure monitoring, with Kjell backing him up. They had reversed roles for the ride uphill. But good reports from the teams here in Mission Control Houston. Everything continues to look good. Starliner is now about 74 meters from the International Space Station, making a slow and methodical retreat, departing from the space station itself. We're going to just about 175 meters.
As Starliner crosses 81 meters from the International Space Station, still seeing the docking lights, the docking and navigation lights from Starliner from that point of view of the space station.
"90 meters out, things continue to look good as Starliner continues its departure. We did get confirmation that the teams at the landing site are currently at their hold position, with the confirmation that they received of a successful undocking. They're getting prepped for a landing out in the western United States later this afternoon. We're targeting for Mountain Time, it's 4:49 p.m., 5:49 p.m. Central Time. East Coast is 6:49.
Flight controllers getting ready to turn off those docking lights on Starliner. Again, as Starliner moves away, and there we see the command was sent and received by the spacecraft, and turned off those docking lights, and now we see a little bit more of the navigation lights. Now that Starliner is coming up on 100 meters away from the International Space Station. Everything continuing at pace, just as it's supposed to for Starliner. Starliner flying free for and rendezvous reporting. Just Starliner just cleared 100 meters. It's heading out to a point about 170 meters from the space station when it'll begin that outbound fly-around maneuver. Starliner's been flying free today for about 17 minutes now.
Getting beautiful views from the International Space Station cameras. Again, these three dots that you see is the Starliner spacecraft. We are in an orbital nighttime. Starliner and the International Space Station are 267 statute miles over Tasmania. They're about to cross over the Terminator line, so we are seeing the horizon of the Earth itself as the sun is about to rise. Everything looking good on this beautiful shot here as we head out to the orbital outbound fly-around maneuver. Teams here in Mission Control reporting good performance of the Starliner spacecraft. It's heading where it's supposed to go, and we're at about 112 meters. Again, we're going to 175.
And now that Starliner has cleared beyond that 100-meter point, it was commanded to pick up its speed. Now it's moving about twice as fast as before, which is about 0.2 of a meter per second. So still moving at orbital velocity, but in relative terms to the space station. Still very methodical, very careful path that it's following. And again, space station cameras delivering very lovely views, very wonderful views. flight controllers continuing to work towards that outbound fly around position. That burn should take place a little bit more than 4 minutes from now, and that'll be followed by the exit of Starliner from the keep out sphere, that imaginary boundary around the space station. And this view of the International Space Station coming to us courtesy of the Vesta sensors that are on the nose of Starliner. This is Starliner's look at the International Space Station. You can see there the SpaceX Crew Dragon at the top, the signature truss that holds the solar arrays on the ISS. And then looking basically clockwise, the Japanese experiment module Kibo. Down at the 6 o'clock position, the Russian laboratory, and then the European laboratory, Columbus. So that is exactly how Starliner is looking at the space station as it departs after 5 days docked to the orbiting laboratory.
Beautiful shot. We're starting to see the sun rise in the horizon there. The space station is 270 statute miles just south of New Zealand at this point. We're going into an orbital sunrise. There in the distance is the Boeing Starliner performing well as it departs the International Space Station. We're at about 183 meters, still within the range that we were targeting for the outbound fly around 1. We're getting a good shot of 2 commercial crew vehicles in view at the same time.
Rendezvous officer reporting that the targeting coordinates for the outbound fly around 1 burn have been sent to the Boeing Starliner spacecraft. That's going to command the thrusters to fire and lift Starliner up and over the International Space Station. A little bit different approach than it took on its way in when it approached from the Earth side of the space station and moved around to the forward port, and then guided itself to that docking last Friday. 10 seconds to the burn. Burn underway. Rendezvous reports good burn, good OF1 burn, short for outbound fly around burn, putting Starliner.
Houston Space to Ground 2, OF1 burn was nominal. The vehicle has exited the keep out sphere. This concludes your monitoring per 1.602.
And station copies. It was a great stay by Starliner. We're a little sad to see her go, but looks like a successful mission so far. Godspeed, Starliner.
Great words. Thanks, Farmer.
Astronaut Bob Hines giving some words from the ISS crew as they watched Starliner depart the keep out sphere and begin its departure from the International Space Station. Sad to see it go, and Godspeed, Starliner. We just heard from the ISS crew as Starliner exited the keep-out sphere, and it's begun its move up and over the International Space Station. Of course, there's more folks than the flight controllers for Starliner watching carefully today this departure. Over in the International Space Station flight control room, they're keeping a watch on the Starliner spacecraft as well as it maneuvers around the International Space Station. And Leah Cheshire is over there watching all of that from the space station perspective. Leah?
That's right. Thanks, Steve. We have just crossed over the keep-out sphere, as you heard mentioned. That's that 200-meter invisible sphere around the International Space Station. It helps flight controllers here on the ground monitor the arrival and departure of visiting vehicles, whether or not they have crew on them. Another one of those boundaries is known as the approach ellipsoid, or the AE. And, of course, we aren't scheduled to cross through the AE for another about 34 minutes. And that is a 2-kilometer by 2-kilometer by 4-kilometer invisible boundary. Again, it helps teams monitor the visiting vehicles that come and go to the space station. And of course, we are in a satellite handover from our tracking data and relay satellite systems. But just a look here at what the undocking process looks like. Of course, we had undocking on time coming up on 27 minutes ago, with physical separation happening just shortly after. The outbound fly-around burn has been complete, which put the vehicle outside of the keep-out sphere and will also move it up and over the International Space Station before the vehicle moves behind and then down below the station, preparing for its departure burn, or deorbit burn, I should say. Again, this is all autonomous. The vehicle is flying itself. Eventually, it'll be put into a co-elliptic orbit before the deorbit burn takes place, and we see service module separation from that crew module, eventually landing in White Sands, New Mexico. Things are still looking good over here in the International Space Station flight control room, just right across the hall from the Starliner control room that you see on screen. Teams here in the space station flight control room will continue to monitor the vehicle as it, and you can see it moving up and over the space station now, but teams here in the space station control room will continue monitoring the vehicle as it moves toward the approach ellipsoid and through its exit. And once we reach that point, joint operations will cease, but teams will still be watching and cheering for Starliner as it targets its landing. And with Starliner outside of the keep-out sphere and everything moving well on both sides of the hall from the International Space Station Flight Control Room and Starliner Flight Control Room, we will toss it back over to my teammates Gary and Steve as they walk us through the mission.
Thank you, Leah. All continues to look very good for Starliner's departure from the International Space Station. A little bit after the top of the hour, thanks for tuning in today to watch Starliner undock from the International Space Station after 5 days connected to the orbital laboratory. Starliner disconnected itself from the forward port of the International Space Station just under 30 minutes ago. Right now, Starliner is about 205 meters from the space station. It is on a path to go up and over the space station and get on a course that will lead it to a landing later today at White Sands Space Harbor.
Cleaning.
Go ahead, Waddy, with you on 2.
We just want to make sure you saw that the cleaning is complete, so we can do the ground steps for activation, fan activation.
It's station use now, too, for Waddy. Yeah, thank you for that follow-up. And, yeah, we were watching the status in Optimus, and we have already reactivated those fans.
Excellent, thanks.
Starliner on a path to land later this evening at 5:49 p.m. Central Time, 6:49 Eastern Time. That's going to be in New Mexico, White Sands Space Harbor. And as you can see, some of the cameras on one of the cameras on the ISS looking over the Crew Dragon that's docked there, watching Starliner move away, watching the Boeing Starliner spacecraft move away.
That was a pretty good shot, Steve. I hope we get that back. That was a very good view that represents the commercial crew program and its efforts. Starliner, of course, moving from the forward end of the station to right above. This Crew Dragon spacecraft is docked to the space-facing side of the International Space Station, so we're seeing the Starliner really above the International Space Station at this point. It's heading to that point immediately above the station, and we're expecting to see another burn here in about 6 minutes. That'll send it outside of the approach ellipsoid, which signifies joint operations with the two teams. But an image for sure that truly captures the efforts of the commercial crew program and where we are today in May 2022.
And in some of this imagery, you can make out the entry cover that is open around the nose of Starliner that protects the docking system during entry, and that is the part of the flight that will be coming up later today. So in order to configure Starliner for that entry, that cover is going to swing closed and latch, and that is going to stay in place for the rest of the flight, basically. That time frame's coming up shortly after the next burn, shortly after the departure initiation burn, and some of the heat that Starliner will encounter, just like all spacecraft coming back from low Earth orbit, several thousand degrees of plasma will envelop Starliner. Of course, Starliner equipped with a heat shield on the lower part of it, and thermal blankets and other details of a thermal protection system on the upper part of the spacecraft, and that entry cover kind of completes that that cocoon of protection from the heat that it'll encounter during entry into the atmosphere, and all that, of course, leading to parachutes opening as Starliner descends over White Sands, New Mexico. All that coming up later today, and before we get to that, we are about 4 minutes away from the next burn in this maneuver that Starliner is performing during this highly choreographed maneuver around the International Space Station, all of which is currently taking place some 270 miles, 270 statute miles above the Earth.
Now this departure initiation burn, we'll swing it, the Starliner now really hugging the outside of the keep out sphere. It's 211 meters away from the station at this point, and it'll execute that departure initiation burn at the top of what's called the R bar. Then, if you draw a vertical line straight through the International Space Station, it's essentially right above that. That sends it outside the keep out sphere, and then closer to exit the approach ellipsoid. So it's still a bit of time until we get to that point. But we did execute an outbound fly around maneuver that got us to the forward end of the International Space Station to essentially this point. The Starliner itself, though, does have a capability to keep going, to continue to fly around the International Space Station through a series of additional outbound fly around burns. Outbound fly arounds 2 through 5 will swing it around the International Space Station, and that, of course, would be a pre-planned maneuver to allow the Starliner. You can see the forward end is pointed towards the International Space Station, and there's a hatch window, and it will allow astronauts on the inside to photograph the International Space Station if necessary. But of course, no astronauts inside. We do have Rosie the Rocketeer and Jebediah Kerman inside, but they don't really have the photography skills that we need to take photos of the International Space Station, so we'll forego executing the outbound fly-around maneuvers to continue to fly around the International Space Station and execute that departure initiation burn that sets us up for an anticipated landing later this afternoon.
All these maneuvers being performed by the reaction control system thrusters on Starliner. Small jets make small bursts, less than 100 pounds force each time they pulse, keeping Starliner stable and steering it through. We have larger engines called OMACs. That's short for Orbital Maneuvering and Control System thrusters. Each of those thrusters, we have 20 of them, and each of them generates about 1,500 pounds, 1,500 pounds of force. So they'll be used later today when it's time to slow Starliner down for its return to Earth and to slow it to begin that descent towards White Sands.
What you're seeing here are camera views from the cameras of the International Space Station pointing towards the Starliner vehicle. You can see now these cameras are operated by a flight controller in the International Space Station flight control room who has complete control over the cameras. Doesn't necessarily need the authority from the flight director to make these maneuvers and track. They have autonomy to do so, but they can also control the exposure. And you can see sometimes we're going in and out of exposured images. We do notice that when the image itself is overexposed a bit, we do have better insight into seeing the thrusters. We can see the plumes from the reaction control thrusters. So we'll see what kinds of views we get, but it looks like now 20 seconds from the initiation of that departure initiation burn, looks like we may be getting some good views of the Starliner from the International Space Station. 10 seconds. We'll stand by.
Prop reports burning. This is a 9-second, and we have cutoff. Rendezvous reports good DI burn. We will exit the approach ellipsoid in 22 minutes. And you can see Starliner moving out of that camera view as it continues its exact course, the exact prescribed path. Its exact prescribed path over the International Space Station. Controllers also report that the entry cover is driving closed. Seeing Starliner in this image from another camera on the International Space Station. Starliner is
Station Houston, space to ground 2 for Starliner. DI burn was nominal. Expect approach ellipsoid exit in 22 minutes.
Copy, thanks.
So with that, we're tracking approximately 2:36 p.m. As the estimated time for the Starliner spacecraft to exit the approach ellipsoid. Again, that is a significant marker. It does mark the end of joint operations. Right now, the two flight control teams that are supporting this mission in the Starliner Flight Control Room and the International Space Station Flight Control Room operating under what's called joint flight rules. So we're all playing by the same flight book. But at the approach initiation or approach ellipsoid marker, it'll really be up to the teams in the Starliner Flight Control Room to bring the spacecraft home.
Flight Director Mike Lammers reports entry cover closed and latched, putting Starliner in its configuration for departing the vicinity of the International Space Station. It is on a path to exit the approach ellipsoid in just under 19 minutes from now.
with a good departure initiation burn. Starliner outside the keep-out sphere, as mentioned, heading towards the approach ellipsoid, so it is moving further away from the International Space Station. Right now we're looking at about 480 meters and counting. The rate has increased significantly from when it was much closer to the space station. We were tracking 0.1 and 0.2 meters per second. We're at about 0.85 meters per second now. So you see after AE exit, the Starliner itself still has quite a journey ahead of it. It's about, from the time that the Starliner itself exits the approach ellipsoid to the time that it actually touches down is about just a little over 3 hours.
Flight director confirming and showing all the hooks are closed, meaning that the entry cover is secured at the nose of Starliner.
Again, Starliner is performing nominally. It's about 600 meters from the International Space Station. We were following along with some of the cameras that are mounted on the outside of the International Space Station, but the exposure of the sun is it's hard to get a good lock on the vehicle right now. But we are getting good good data flowing from the spacecraft. We'll see if we can regain some of those views. It is during an orbital during an orbital daytime. Space Station and Starliner spacecraft are about 262 statute miles over the Pacific Ocean. We're about to cross over Panama.
Propulsion officer reporting 12 good crew module jets. The team just did a quick hot fire of those crew module jets. They are the very small RCS thrusters. That was just a checkout of the system. That's the those are the jets that will position Starliner during its return to Earth. The service module carries most of the thrusters, but at the very end of the flight, which is coming up later today, the service module will separate and the crew module will fly on its own. And this hot fire test was confirming that those 12 thrusters are performing well. And again, propulsion reporting that all 12 jets did exactly what they were supposed to during that very brief hot fire test. Next up, we're coming up on the departure resume burn. That is going to come up in 1 minute 43 seconds.
All right, everything's looking good for Starliner's departure. We're coming up in that departure resume burn in about 10 seconds. And we dig it. And we did pass the departure resume burn milestone. Flight controllers, the rendezvous officer, very happy with the trajectory of Starliner as it makes its way towards exiting the approach ellipsoid. Things looking good for Starliner's departure from the International Space Station. We're still tracking an exit of that approach ellipsoid in about 6 minutes or so.
And you know, we talk, as we mentioned a lot, we talk a lot about the machines, we talk a lot about the spacecraft and the mechanics of orbital flight and everything like that. And, you know, none of this gets done without people, and it takes It takes a lot of folks to do stuff this complex, and one of those folks is having his last shift during today's Starliner return. It is you see him there on the right side of the screen in the blue shirt. That is Rick Kressig. He is one of the ground control. We call him GC, and he's working his last shift in space flight. He's been in the business more than 30 years, and he is retiring. Flight Director Mike Lammers congratulating him just moments ago, and so Rick will be going from space flight to his retirement. Great help to us on the Starliner team. He's one of the folks who coordinates a number of different things here in the control room, and does magnificent work. So on behalf of all of us on the Starliner team, congratulations to him, and a thank you. Flight controllers continuing to monitor Starliner's pace and course around the International Space Station. Starliner staying on its prescribed path away from the International Space Station, flying itself autonomously. No crew on board Starliner, and the crew of the International Space Station having bid farewell. With all of its major burns completed, we're about 3 minutes away from the Starliner leaving the approach ellipsoid and bringing to an end the joint operations phase of this Orbital Flight Test 2 mission. All of this being set on a course to have Starliner head for a landing later today at White Sands Space Harbor in New Mexico. That landing set for 5:49 p.m. Houston time, 6:49 p.m. in the east. And locally there at the landing site, it will be 4:49 p.m. in the Mountain Time Zone.
Starliner right on track to meet that landing. Of course, we've been following the undocking operations. You're seeing some of the telemetry following the Starliner spacecraft itself as it separated from the International Space Station right on time earlier this afternoon, 1:36 p.m. Central Time, and has been making its slow and methodical exit and departure from the space station to head towards that landing. If you guessed the approach ellipsoid was the yellow circle that you have in view, you would be correct. That marker is the end of joint operations with the International Space Station flight control teams. The Starliner flight control teams will carry the vehicle all the way back to a landing in the western United States. It's about a little more than 3 hours from the time we exit that yellow sphere there to the time that we land in the western United States. That exit's anticipated about a minute from now. We'll wait for confirmation from the teams that the Starliner has, of course, exited the approach ellipsoid. It is at this point more than a kilometer away from the station. We're tracking about 1,100 meters.
And about 30 seconds left before Starliner leaves the approach ellipsoid. We are still getting great views of the spacecraft from the International Space Station. You're seeing there Starliner against the daylit surface of the Earth. In fact, that is off the Atlantic seaboard. And in the foreground there to the right, that's the solar panel from another commercial vehicle, not another commercial crew vehicle, but a commercial cargo vehicle called Cygnus. Camera view continuing to track Starliner, which is exactly where it needs to be, about 20 seconds away from the approach ellipsoid exit. Entry cover closed and latched. Of course, zooming in.
Station Houston, space to ground 2 for Starliner. Starliner has exited the approach ellipsoid and is on a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory. We're beginning C2V2 deactivation. This is your last Starliner status call until the deorbit burn.
Station copies. Thanks for the update. Godspeed, Starliner.
Godspeed, Starliner.
And with that, you heard that confirmation being relayed up to the International Space Station crew. Starliner spacecraft has officially exited the approach ellipsoid. So that 24-hour free drift safe trajectory is really just as a precautionary thing, just in case Starliner needed to. It would be able to stay in an orbit for 24 hours with in a safe trajectory, not with any contact with the International Space Station, any risk of contact. So that is a standard free drift trajectory that it's on. But with that confirmation, that is the end of joint operations, and that, of course, has been relayed up to the International Space Station crew. They're relieved of their duties for monitoring, really up to the Starliner teams to get the Starliner home a little bit more than 3 hours from now.
Starliner flying its perfect course. First undocking from the forward port of the International Space Station on time today at 1:36 p.m. Central Time. Now departing the approach ellipsoid a little bit more than an hour later. Everything looking really good for Starliner. And across the hall, we're going to check in one more time with Leah Cheshire, who's been looking at the ISS perspective and that flight control team, as they have watched just as eagerly as the Starliner control team as the Boeing Starliner spacecraft has left the immediate vicinity, I should say, of the International Space Station. Leah?
Absolutely, Steve, and thanks so much. Of course, since the Starliner vehicles out of the approach ellipsoid, joint operations have now ceased between the two teams. Of course, International Space Station flight controllers here are still monitoring all of the systems aboard the station itself, and they'll continue to watch the rest of Starliner's journey home. But as they relayed up to the crew, any actions are now complete on their part and are all in the hands of the Starliner team across the hall. And with that successful departure from the approach ellipsoid, that's our final checkpoint from the space station team today. Thank you so much for having us and allowing us to be part of the mission. We're excited to see Starliner back again in the future. Thanks, and back over to you, Steve and Gary.
All right, thanks, Leah. That's right. That ends joint operations with the International Space Station teams. But of course, the mission is not over. We'll soon be wrapping up our coverage of the Starliner's undocking and departure from the International Space Station. But our coverage will continue to follow the Starliner for a landing in the western United States. That coverage will begin 5:45 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 4:45 p.m. Central. If you're out near the desert, near the landing site in White Sands Space Harbor, New Mexico, that'll be 3:45 p.m. Mountain Time. But Steve, it's been a pleasure to follow this mission through its undocking and exit the approach ellipsoid. It was a very successful undocking and exit, and so we'll be looking forward to seeing the Starliner very soon coming home.
Boeing Starliner spacecraft has been performing very well throughout this orbital flight test 2 mission. It's been put through a lot of different paces, just as you're supposed to do with a flight test, and so far working very, very well. Everything is going well. Can't wait to see this landing. Starliner is going to go through one of the more dynamic phases of the mission as it plunges through Earth's atmosphere, encounters that heat, and of course opens the parachutes and comes down in White Sands Space Harbor, where our teams both from Boeing and from NASA are standing by to welcome it back to Earth after what's been about a 6-day mission.
That's right. And of course, tune in for our coverage of those events. But for the teams here in the Starliner Flight Control Room and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, that'll wrap up our coverage for now. Stay tuned for the landing coverage coming up in just a couple of hours. With that, this is Mission Control Houston.